A submarine the size of a destroyer. A ship with one knockout gun turret. Enormous, sluggish, steampunk behemoths. An aircraft carrier made out of a paddlewheel steamship. These are some of the most bizarre and unconventional warships of all time. Some were the result of periods of unchecked innovation, where the time between two technological achievements can be littered with awkward, unusual, and failed attempts at pushing the boundaries. After all, for every Model T and Mustang, there's a Ford Edsel in the middle. So today, in the start of a new series, let's look at 4 very unique vessels. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and these are some of the most unhinged warship designs from history. Conventionally, and throughout maritime history, submarines have been small vessels compared to most of their naval fleet mates. They're designed to maneuver easily, navigate through tight spaces, and be difficult to detect. So one could imagine the surprise of sailors on one of 2 US destroyers in August 1945 when an anomaly popped up on their radar systems. Not only had they just detected the largest submarines the world had ever seen, but the submarine was actually larger than the destroyers themselves. What they had inadvertently discovered was the Japanese Sentoku I-400 class. These subs were 400 feet or 121 meters long and 39 feet or 12 meters wide. They had a surface speed of 19 knots, on the fast end for a submarine. They could motor out to sea for 4 months at a time and had a cruising distance of the equivalent of circling the globe 1.5 times before needing to refuel. No other submarine at the time was capable of these impressive feats. A sub of this size, capable of these speeds and having the ability to travel such huge distances, would have made the I-400 class vessels unique enough in their own right. But what made these submarines truly remarkable was that they had the ability to carry aircraft. Now, we've discussed previously on this channel the advancement of the aircraft carrier. We covered how they went from being mere afterthoughts in ship design to central figures in any one country's navy, shifting the focus of battle of the seas to the battle in the skies. All the same, Japan's interest in combining submarines and aircraft carriers remains an incredibly fascinating endeavour. How did we even get here? Well, we need to turn the clock back to 1941. The major proponent of what would become the I-400 class design was the same mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attacks on December 7th that year. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the commander of Japan's combined fleet. After the Pearl Harbor attacks, Yamamoto was concerned about what would happen to Japan once the United States collectively got back on their feet and reassembled their battered navy. He decided that a series of surprise attacks was the best way for Japan to maintain military successes against the United States and keep their assets tied down. But he also knew that America was not easily going to be caught off guard again. Yamamoto was a big proponent for the concept of a submarine aircraft carrier. These vessels would be used to get Japan's aircraft near American cities without being detected. Aircraft carriers were big, relatively slow, nearly defenseless targets that needed a sizable escort. If a submarine could surface way offshore, then the surprise would be complete. The idea was that the submarines would surface, launch their planes by catapult, and then dive again before being discovered and stay in place. The aircraft would carry out their bombing raids, return to the area near the submersed vessel, and land on the water. A crane on board the boat would hoist the plane back on board. As a precaution, it was decided the submarines would also carry torpedoes for engaging any patrolling enemy shipping. This thought was not entirely a novel concept. Other navies, like the English, French, the Germans, and the Italians, had all experimented with aircraft carrying subs before the war. The theory was they could deploy their submarines like scouts to hunt for enemy shipping or threats. In fact, Japan had used something similar too, like the modified Type A1 submarines, a class of aircraft carrying cruiser submarine. But even though they were quite large, they could only carry a single airplane each, the relatively basic Yokosuka E-14Y. All told, Japan would end up fielding 36 aircraft carrying subs during the war. They refined the concept with the Type A2 sub, a larger boat with space enough for 2 planes. But Yamamoto wanted to push the boundaries by having the new class carry 3 planes on each sub. The initial targets of the new class were going to be New York City and Washington, D.C., but as World War II continued on through the design and building stage, Japan's focus turned to defending their homeland. With that, the new target for the submarines became the Panama Canal. Destroying the canal would cripple America's ability to get reinforcements quickly from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, buying the Imperial Navy crucial time. The biggest design hurdle was actually storing the aircraft. A watertight 100-foot-long hangar had to be installed above the pressure hull where the crew lived and worked, which itself had to be given an unusual figure-8 cross-section to support the enormous weight on top of it. Making the hangar watertight was no mean feat either. It needed a huge 2-inch, 55mm thick rubber gasket around the equally huge vault-style steel door that had to be shut hydraulically or manually hand-cranked open from the outside. It left the I-400s vulnerable to depth charge damage, and it limited their operational depth. But the hangar would prove to be enormously useful, providing the subs with a massive storage space for cargo or provisions. Usually, in the hangar, you'd be able to find 3 Aichi M6A Siran float planes, a nifty little aircraft specifically designed for use on the subs. They folded up easily for transport, and they were powered by a cool Japanese-built version of the same engine that powered the Messerschmitt 109. They could carry a fairly impressive payload for aircraft of their size too, up to 850 kilograms or 1,870 pounds of bombs or a torpedo. It would take just 45 minutes to prepare and launch the aircraft from their catapult up on the deck. Now, figuring out a method for the planes to get back on the submarine was slightly trickier. Initially, it was thought by some the planes could be disposable, and the pilots could put their craft down on the water or even bail out and await rescue. Clearly, nobody actually consulted with the pilots on that one. But the Aichi Seiran had been custom built for the I-400 and the A-type modified submarines. They weren't cheap, and you certainly couldn't be throwing them away. Instead, the subs were fitted with clever collapsible cranes that could swing up, pluck the float planes out of the sea and bring them home again. So while they were successful in their ability to carry planes on board, and also while submerged, the unique design did not make the I-400 class the most seaworthy group of submarines the world had ever seen. Yes, they were fast in a straight line, on the surface, but they were also unwieldy and difficult to maneuver thanks to their relatively small rudders. That huge size made them much easier to spot on radar screens or from the air as well. The large hangar and offset conning tower could also act like a sail, sending the boat off course in any kind of strong wind from the beam. Dive time was slow too, taking around a full minute, but the design brief had been met. With 3 boats completed by 1945, it was time to see what they could do. With just 1 month of the war left and Japan's position crumbling fast, the proposed plan of attacking the Panama Canal was scrapped in favour of a raid on the US Navy base at Ulithi Atoll, a large anchorage about 500 kilometres or 420 miles southwest of Guam. 2 of the I-400s were joined by a pair of modified, smaller A-class boats, giving the force a combined total of 14 aircraft. Not exactly impressive numbers, but enough to do some damage in the event of a surprise attack. The force set off in August 1945 with the task of hitting 15 American carriers moored at Ulithi with kamikaze attacks. The attack aircraft were even illegally painted with American markings. But the plan almost immediately went awry when I-13, one of the support subs, was sunk by American aircraft and a destroyer, but then came the biggest shock of all, the surrender of Japan. The situation became a confused mess. One order came from the Emperor, imploring all Japanese soldiers to surrender, while another order from the Navy ordered all submarines to continue with their mission. Just hours before the planned attack on Ulithi, a final official command came in that directed the submarines to destroy their weapons and return to the Japanese base at Kure. I-401 encountered the American sub USS Segundo, and she was ordered to stop and be boarded. The sheer scale of the submarine must have shocked the Segundos because the Japanese boat was over 100 feet longer and nearly 4 times heavier than theirs. USS Blue, a destroyer, accepted I-400's surrender. They were probably just as surprised because the I-400 was also longer than their ship and more than twice as heavy. American intelligence was taken completely by surprise by the sudden appearance of these ocean-going monsters, and they were keen to learn what mechanical lessons they might provide. After their capture though, the Soviet Union got word that they were in the hands of the Americans, and they wanted a chance to inspect them themselves. With the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly souring following the end of the war, the Americans scuttled the subs rather than let the Russians get their hands on them. They lay in about 2,300 feet of water off the coast of Oahu, and the wreck sites were discovered in 2013. Originally, a fleet of 18 I-400 type boats was planned, But that idea was scaled back to 9, and then, when the project's biggest backer, Admiral Yamamoto, died in 1943, just 5 subs. Of those 5 planned, only 3 were complete, and then only I-400 and I-401 ever made it to sea. Measuring the success of the I-400 class is tricky. They were large, hard to maneuver, and easy to find. They never had a chance to be put into practice with their arrival so close to the end of the war. But on the other hand, their purpose was to carry multiple aircraft on both the surface and underwater, and they certainly succeeded at being able to do that. So from a technological and engineering standpoint, they were a success. But you really have to question the validity of the strategy at play. A monstrous, resource-consuming submarine class capable of carrying only 3 small attack planes is extremely unlikely to turn the tide of the war. Heck, a whole fleet of 18 boats, even if finished, could carry just 54 aircraft between them. A single US carrier could carry 90 planes or more, and the US fielded more than 100 aircraft carriers. In the end, the I-400 class is another great example of the resource-consuming wonder weapon so favoured by the Germans and the Japanese, one which was unlikely to change the fortunes of war, but which chewed up a lot of time, energy, and steel. But it doesn't make them any less awesome. Even the most casual history fan can name a few kinds of warships: battleships, submarines, aircraft carriers, and so on. But how many people know what a monitor is? We've talked a bit about them on this channel before. Some monitors look just like something a 5-year-old might draw for fun, but monitors played a very real role in many of the world's navies, and one of the strangest of the bunch is the Italian vessel FA di Bruno. Monitors were not named after the lizard. The class was given its name by the famous USS Monitor of 1861, a Union ironclad made famous by the indecisive Battle of Hampton Roads, when that warship and a Confederate contemporary spent a whole day blasting shots at each other to no real effect. The concept was simple: a warship armed with a big turret gun sitting as low in the water as possible to minimise its silhouette. The low freeboard meant the class weren't very good seakeepers, and their operations were reserved for shallow coastal work. During the First World War, the Monitor had found success as a shore bombarding vessel, and a simple and cost-effective method of mounting battleship guns on small hulls. Eventually, navies moved away from the shallow freeboard of earlier designs, and 20th century monitors began to more resemble destroyers, with tall hulls more suited to open ocean, but still fielding disproportionately massive guns. In 1916, the proposed Italian Francesco Caracciolo class of battleship was cancelled thanks to material shortage. It left the Navy with a sudden surplus of big guns. Guns which could make a difference in the war at sea. Instead of letting them go to waste, plans were drawn up quickly for a monitor to take them to sea. FA di Bruno was the result, a confused hodgepodge of a ship that had more in common with an island fort than with a ship of the line. She was powered by 2 triple expansion steam engines discarded from British torpedo boats that pushed her to a maximum speed of 3.3 knots, about walking pace. Now, if that seems a bit reckless, fear not, because her maximum service speed was limited to just 2.5. The FA di Bruno's crew was made up of 45 officers and enlisted men who were squeezed into her 182-foot, 55.5-metre long hull. When people describe the construction of monitors as being cheap and cheerful, they're not embellishing. But FA di Bruno was quite unique, even in comparison to other monitors of the time. Her flanks and decks were built to a prismatic shape, like the armoured shell of a turtle, with the sides angled downward to guard against incoming shells, and her extremely low freeboard making her harder to sight and hit. Her deck surface was bare in typical monitor fashion, but featured a towering tripod mast which rose up behind the main gun turret and supported a protected bridge. Speaking of main gun turrets, yeah, wow, the massive 15-inch, 381mm guns were housed twinned in a revolving turret. I seriously cannot even imagine what it would have been like to be aboard this thing when those guns went off. Her hull, in addition to its prismatic shape, also had a concrete cofferdam, 9.5 feet or 2.9 meters thick, for added protection. FA di Bruno was expected to engage enemy shore installations, so it was thought she'd need to be protected mostly from field artillery, so to that end, her protection was quite well thought out. It would be pretty hard to hit this thing from a couple of miles away with your 8cm field gun. Despite their unusual design, construction and purpose, Italy actually invested in 14 monitors for their navy. They were designed to specifically meet three requirements. First, in being able to carry heavy, long-range artillery to disrupt the front line and allow a breakthrough in the Austro-Hungarian lines because the big battleship caliber guns had a maximum range of nearly 20 kilometers or 12.5 miles. Second, there'd need to be stable gun platforms to maximize accuracy and fire effect. And finally, they needed to be able to operate in extremely shallow coastal waters. To that end, FA di Bruno, despite having virtually nothing above the waterline, featured only 7 feet, or 2.2 meters of ship, below the waterline. Now, to offset the dangerous propensity for rolling and even capsizing, she was given the beam, or the width, of an Oceanliner or battleship, even though she was shorter than a destroyer. The FA di Bruno and fellow monitor Alfredo Capellini did play a small role in the 11th of 12 battles of Isonzo. These were a series of conflicts between the Austro-Hungarians and Italian armies fought in the latter part of 1917. The FA di Bruno and Alfredo Capellini, along with 2 British monitors, bombarded the Austro-Hungarian positions just as they had been designed to do, and although the battle was a victory for the Italians, the role of the monitors probably had very little to do with it. A few months after the Battle of Isonzo, the FA di Bruno was hit by a storm, driven ashore and badly damaged. Now, perhaps signalling her importance to the Italian Navy as a whole, she was left stranded and not salvaged for almost a year. The FA di Bruno was decommissioned in 1924, but returned to service as a floating battery under the name GM-194 at the beginning of World War II. The aging vessel was towed to Genoa, where she would spend the rest of the war. She was there when the Royal Navy bombarded the port in February 1941, and even fired off 3 shots in return, but that was all. After the Italian armistice, the strange vessel was captured by the Germans, who somehow thought she might be of some use and wanted to turn her back into a monitor, but the war ended before those plans ever came to pass. Ultimately, FA di Bruno was scuttled in 1945 and dismantled. She was a strange ship, to be sure, with a rectangular profile and a sluggish maneuverability, but in some ways, she should be considered a success because she'd been designed to be a stable gun platform for the big 15-inch battleship rifles. She was able to do just that for nearly 30 years. But as far as unhinged warship designs go, it's hard to think of anything more off the wall than Italy's first proper monitor. Often with technological advancements, you have a before and after and the slightly awkward in between. Battleships were no exception, and we've had a lot of fun talking about the weird time in the Royal Navy when wooden sailing ships, which had basically been perfected over hundreds of years, gave way to iron steamships, which often left a lot to be desired. One fun example of these is Britain's Colossus-Class battleships, Ironclads, which implemented a few firsts for the Royal Navy and the world. The Colossus-Class battleship was born out of an era where the French, British, German, American, Russian and Italian navies rushed to compete with each other with each successive class of battleship. In a running skirmish between guns and armour, the British had a series of successes and failures. HMS Ajax had been a class-leading battleship when she was laid down in 1876, but it took 4 years to complete her, and even then, on trials, she was found to exhibit some bad behaviour. Such was the pace of design and the frantic construction schedule at the time that even before Ajax was finished and in service, designs were already put into place for an improved class of battleship. Now, the key to Colossus's development was the introduction in the Royal Navy of breech-loading guns. These had been tested years earlier, but they proved dangerous and unpredictable. But the development of an automatic safety device meant breech loaders were at last capable of being fired with reliability in mind. And the simple fact was that a breech-loaded gun was a bigger and more powerful gun than a muzzle-loaded one, for the fact that large shells and bags of powder could be more easily fed into the breech at the back instead of being stuffed down the muzzle. This resulted in the development of a big 12-inch 25 caliber gun. The Navy just needed something to put it on. Colossus was originally proposed to be significantly longer than any other British battleship in service, but the Admiralty settled on a more modest 325-foot length. But still, her slightly longer hull and shallower beam meant she could squeeze an extra knot of speed out over her contemporaries. Colossus's true pioneering chops lay in the fact she was the first to use steel rather than iron for nearly all of the hull structure aside from the stem and stern castings, and she was the first truly modern battleship to field big, breech-loading rifled guns in turrets. The guns were impressive for the time, In trials, Colossus managed a blistering 4 rounds in 6 minutes from one gun and even scored 3 hits on a target at full steam. Breech loaders were just fast like that. In a naval battle, the amount of time and labour saved can make all the difference. On their sea trials, both Colossus-Class ships performed well and vastly exceeded their contract design speeds, with Colossus, underloaded, hitting 16.5 knots, which threw up an enormous bow wave described as being like a solid wall of water 13 feet long. Crucially, they improved on the Ajax-class's sea handling characteristics, but they still left a lot to be desired. Gun ports were only 12 feet above the waterline, and if the ship rolled just 13 degrees, the guns' muzzles would kiss the water if they were trained to the side. They had a quick roll, which required the fitting of large tanks down below to stabilise them, but their massive height meant they were liable to catch the wind and be carried off course were the helmsman not paying attention. In fact, this is why Colossus has made this list for the most unhinged warship designs. She towered high out of the water, with a hull that stood up like a steampunk wall stories tall, and there in the centre of the ship were her twin gun turrets, which, thanks to the raised forecastle and stern, had to be offset to fire forward or aft. For good measure, she was fitted with a ram bow, a device that did much more to act as a bulbous bow and cut down her fuel consumption at speed. While the technological achievements of the Colossus-Class are notable, her career and that of her sister was more mundane. The pair engaged in training and testing, but were rendered obsolete just a few short years after their introduction. It must have been an exciting time to be a naval architect in the British Admiralty, when the government poured funds into creating the biggest and baddest warships the world had yet seen at an exponential rate. While they were definitely not without their growing pains, the Colossus-Class of battleship was a success, even if it was a short-lived one. With their towering hulls and funnels, the class certainly lived up to their name. They were true steam leviathans of the Victorian world. Now, we've talked about this next ship on the channel before, but I just had to bring it up again because the story is so fascinating. That one time the US Navy converted a passenger-carrying paddle-wheel steamboat into a fully fledged medal-winning aircraft carrier, and it actually worked. In the early years of the Second World War, the United States had a bit of a problem. Its aircraft carriers were tied up in the Pacific Theatre, seeing desperate action in huge battles like Midway and the Coral Sea. They'd gone from mere curiosities to becoming the backbone of the modern Navy, and they had to be protected at all costs. But back home, pilots needed training for carrier operations, which came with their own quirks and immense dangers. Pilots landing on aircraft carriers faced a whole host of dangers their land-based colleagues didn't have to. For one, the weather was totally beyond the crew's control, and it could shift drastically on approach to the carrier. Chief among quirks for training carrier pilots was the length of the landing zone itself. Land-based pilots could enjoy runways thousands of feet long, but carrier pilots had just a short few hundred feet to work with. They had to put their aircraft down with pinpoint accuracy, usually just above stall speed. Of course, then the runway they were landing on was moving by itself as well. The early carrier pilots were their own breed of gutsy daredevil, but without an actual aircraft carrier to train on, pilots would be woefully underprepared when they got to the actual theatre of operations. This is where some Navy planners got a clever, unhinged idea. The SS C&B was a grand passenger steamer launched in November 1912 by the Detroit Shipbuilding Company in Michigan. Named using the initials of its owners, the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company, C&B, get it? The C&B boasted accommodations for over 1,500 passengers. At 500 feet, or 152 metres in length, and 58 feet, or 17.6 metres in beam, she was among the largest and most opulent passenger steamers on the Great Lakes. And she was, in fact, the largest sidewheel steamer in the world at the time, a fact that would come in very handy for the Navy. She had boasted an impressive array of amenities aimed at passenger comfort, including staterooms, elegant dining saloons, and spacious promenade decks. In fact, the decision to use old-fashioned inclined steam engines was taken specifically for passengers who wanted a good night's sleep on board. The engines could develop impressive horsepower at low revolutions, creating less vibration and making for a more comfortable trip. She was an impressive, quirky ship to be sure, and the SS C&B served the Great Lakes region for over 2 decades. But then came the Second World War. Navy Commander Richard Whitehead had come up with the idea of making use of lake steamers for training purposes, but it took some time for the seemingly ludicrous idea to catch on. Remarkably though, the SS-CNB was acquired by the Navy in March 1942 and underwent a radical transformation. Her impressive length and beam made her an ideal platform for use as a training aircraft carrier, and Navy workers got started on converting her. Her luxurious accommodations and superstructure were removed, and in their place a flat-top flight deck was installed along with a small island superstructure. She was fitted with arresting cables that would seize landing aircraft, and it was reported by the Buffalo Courier Express that 45 miles of welding and 45,000 bolts went into her. Commissioned as the USS Wolverine in August 1942, because Michigan is known as the Wolverine State, go Spartans, the vessel became one of 2 freshwater aircraft carriers alongside the USS Sable, tasked with training naval aviators in carrier takeoffs and landings. In fact, Sable had once been a sidewheel steamer too, the SS Greater Buffalo, built in 1924. The choice of the Great Lakes for these operations was strategic too, offering a safe, controlled environment away from the threat of enemy submarines and allowing for nearly year-round operations, albeit limited by winter ice. It was also a question of convenience and making the least impact on Navy resources. If Wolverine had been training on the open ocean, for example, instead, then an escort force of destroyers would be needed every time she left port. Operating primarily out of Chicago alongside USS Sable, the Wolverine played a crucial role in the training of thousands of Navy pilots. The 2 unusual ships came to be known as the Corn Belt Fleet. These aviators would go on to play a pivotal role in the Navy's aerial campaigns in the Pacific, contributing significantly to the Allied victory. The training operations aboard the Wolverine were not without their challenges though, including navigating the unpredictable weather of the Great Lakes and accommodating the limitations imposed by the vessel's original design. They weren't real aircraft carriers after all. There were no hangars or storage decks, elevators, or anything like that. Plus, the ships weren't fast enough to create the adequate wind conditions required for safe landings, so on calm days, operations had to be halted entirely. But despite these hurdles, the Wolverine and her semi-sister ship, the Sable, provided invaluable service in preparing naval aviators for the rigours of carrier operations. The USS Wolverine was decommissioned in November 1945, shortly after the end of World War II. It had been an unusual end to such a unique ship, but CNB had served her country well and was scrapped after a successful 3-decade-long career. As a fun little footnote, it turns out that the owners, the CNB Transit Company, had vastly inflated the value of the ship when they sold it to the government, who, when they found out, were not happy and hunted down more than $250,000 from CNB stockholders. It wasn't very patriotic of CNB, wouldn't you say? Sometimes a design looks good and practical on paper, but this may not carry over into the real world once the thing is made out of iron and steel. Enter the strange Russian circular Ironclads, the Novgorod and her half-sister, the Vice-Admiral Popov. The basic idea behind these defensive monitors was based on the theory of Scottish shipbuilder John Elder, to shorten the hull of the ship and widen the beam, or its width, thereby reducing the total area needed to be covered by armour while also improving manoeuvrability. Russian Vice Admiral A. Popov took the idea and ran with it, widening the beam so much that the ship became almost completely circular and flattening the bottoms entirely to totally minimise the draft, that is, how much of the ship sat underwater. This design would also allow for thicker armour overall, as well as the ability to carry larger and more powerful guns. That sounds great, right? Well, in the 1870s, for better or worse, the Novgorod and the slightly larger Vice-Admiral Popov, a pair of ships also known as the Popovkas, were built and were fully in service by 1877. Now, while the ships certainly looked a bit unusual, the concept itself is actually nothing new. In ancient Mesopotamia, India, and Asia, round floating platforms had been used to transport people and cargo across waterways. Even in Great Britain and Ireland, small round basket boats with flat bottoms called coracles have been used for centuries as something of a simple vessel designed for use in swiftly flowing streams. These vessels were obviously more primitive, being made of interwoven willow rods tied together with bark. Animal skin was used as an outer layer, with a thin layer of tar to make it waterproof. And these circular flat-bottomed, single-passenger boats were easy to maneuver, lightweight, and hardly disturbed the water below, making them a very clever sort of fishing vessel. However, applying the same design principles to a warship would prove to have some unfortunate, almost comical consequences. Despite their peculiar design, the Popovkas did operate well under certain conditions. They were found to be very stable gun platforms with easy roll in good weather. They would also be capable of firing in a full 360 degrees. And on top of this, they were extremely well protected for their time due to their heavy armour. The rounded deck made use of 2.75 inches or 70 millimeters of armour, consisting of 3 layers of plating. The lower section of the funnels at the base of the engine room skylight had armour plates that were a whopping 6 inches or 150 millimeters thick. They also had decent firing capability. While the rate of fire was slow, about 1 round every 10 minutes or so, the guns could effectively penetrate 11 inches or 28 centimeters of armour at a distance of 800 yards or 731 meters. Initially, the Imperial Russian Navy liked Popov's idea so much, they ordered a fleet of 10 of the things, planning to use them as coastal defense ships in the Kerch Straits and the mouth of the Dnieper River. However, this plan would prove too expensive, and in the end, probably fortunately, only 2 were ever commissioned. Once the ships were built, it was found that they suffered from some rather serious design flaws. Firstly, steering was nearly impossible, with the comparatively light hull and slow speeds proving ineffective against the rather strong currents in the Dnieper River. Fred T. Jane, the famous warship historian, was quoted as saying, "On a trial cruise, the Novgorod and the Vice Admiral Popov went up the Dnieper very nicely for some distance until they turned to retire. Then the current caught them, and they were carried out to sea, whirled helplessly round and around, with every soul on board helplessly incapacitated by vertigo." They're also prone to rapid rolling and anything but flat calm in the Black Sea, which itself was known for its rough and turbulent weather. In severe cases, heavy storms would cause the ship to pitch enough so as to lift her propellers out of the water. And on top of this, it's said that the recoil of firing even a single gun could reportedly cause the ships to spin out of control, with their underpowered engines and propellers unable to set them straight again. And this was when seas were calm enough to allow the ships to reliably fire those guns in the first place. The design flaws don't just end there. The circular hull created massive amounts of resistance and drag, and the 6 outer propellers were found to do little to nothing at all to combat this. The hull shape also rendered the rudder almost useless, and the ship reportedly could take up to 45 minutes to make a full circle, and the flat bottom design didn't help either, causing the ships to act like skimming dishes on the water, offering even less control and steering accuracy. The circular design itself proved to not be a total failure, surprisingly. In 1880, a similar concept was used for the Russian imperial yacht Livadia, also the brainchild of Popov. With the yacht counterpart, Popov kept the circular hull but added a conventional bow and stern. Called a gigantic life-size experiment, and despite having been used only once for her intended purpose as a yacht, the Livadia's design was ultimately deemed a success, having learned from the failures of the Popovkas before her. She was surprisingly maneuverable and decently fast, surprising naval architects during her sea trials with her stability, and they deemed her to be just as efficient as any other conventionally designed ship. Overall, though, the theory behind these ships made a decent amount of sense. The supposed maneuverability, coupled with heavy armament, the potential for all-round firepower, was a solid enough idea, especially when taking into account the limited scope with which these ships were meant to be used, essentially as coastal defense, and never in a true sea battle. Quickly, it became clear, though, that factors such as weather, gun recoil, and sea currents had other ideas in mind for these warships, rendering them terribly ineffective, causing them to go down in history as some of the worst warships ever designed. But despite this, the Popovkas would not be fully decommissioned until 1903, a full 30 years after they were launched. Widely considered by many to be the worst battleship ever built, the USS Massachusetts was a class leader of early battleships built for the US Navy, but inexperience would creep into the ship's design and result in its failure. Commissioned in 1896, the Massachusetts was designed with sheer power in mind. At the time, she and her sisters, the Indiana and the Oregon, were the first true modern battleships in the American fleet, and as a result, they came with massive amounts of firepower. All 3 ships were fully decked out with 4 8-inch secondary batteries amidships, and then 2 massive 13-inch guns forward and aft. These were some of the largest guns ever built at the time, and it was believed that the Massachusetts could potentially be extremely powerful as a coastal defense vessel. Ultimately, though, the designers failed to take the weight of all this machinery into consideration, and this would result in dire consequences for the ship. At 350 feet long and displacing around 10,000 long tons, the USS Massachusetts was a comparatively small ship that was simply over-encumbered by the weight of the guns and the ammunition that was fitted to her. As a result, when both of her 13-inch guns on either side were turned to aim at an enemy vessel or target, the movement would cause the whole ship to list so severely that the entire deck and even the guns on that side of the ship would be plunged temporarily underwater. It's interesting to note that at the time, the US Navy was still a developing power, and it was learning new lessons all the time. The Bureau of Ordnance oversaw the design of the ships, but needed to take input from the builders on what would or might not work. Coupled with a great sense of inexperience was the usual meddlesome political machine. This was the first time a Navy had attempted to fit such a huge amount of firepower into such a small platform. And although the ships were experimental and more like prototypes, because of this, it would ultimately lead to their failure as a design. They were small and they were cramped. Massachusetts and her sister ships only had 9 line officers, which meant that they didn't have a dedicated officer for torpedoes, secondary battery, and main battery armament. But even worse, for a combat vessel, they had no margin for officers killed or wounded in action. The failures of the Massachusetts class become quite obvious when you take into account the colossal weight that they were carrying. The 4 13-inch gun turrets alone weighed 136,000 pounds, or 68 tons each, and the shells used for these turrets each weighed a massive 1,130 pounds, or 512 kilograms. Now that's not to say anything of the million pounds of coal required for the engines, and the hundreds of thousands of pounds of ammo for the remaining guns on board. In her sea and gunnery trials, the unstable ship rolled heavily, unseating both of her main gun turrets, which jumped their retaining rings. They had to be set back, and bilge kills were hurriedly installed on either side of the ship to make her more stable. On top of all of this, the Massachusetts was also woefully under-armoured. While she was built with armoured sides that measured about 5 inches thick at the waterline, the armour was positioned too low, and this rendered its protection almost null. By contrast, the hull below the waterline was left totally unarmoured. This oversight led to the Massachusetts nearly being sunk on 3 separate occasions during her career after hitting submerged objects. Massachusetts was twice decommissioned and then recommissioned due to her flawed design. First in 1906 after an explosion of one of her turrets tragically killed 9 aboard, and again just a few short years later in 1914 after spending most of her time laid up in the reserve fleet. But finally, in 1920, she was decommissioned for the final time, scuttled, and used, maybe fittingly, as target practice off the Pensacola coast of Florida. The story does have a somewhat wholesome ending though. In 1993, the wreck of the USS Massachusetts was officially named a Florida Underwater Archaeological Preserve. Even though she spent much of the last century underwater, the wreck is actually remarkably intact and teeming with fascinating wildlife. In fact, she's now become a well-documented artificial reef. Well lit by the sun and resting in relatively shallow sandy waters, the Massachusetts is conveniently positioned as a popular diving destination, giving divers the rare opportunity to get up close and personal with all manner of aquatic creatures, as well as one of history's greatest battleship blunders. Now, there are some warships whose design flaws are largely mathematical or logistical miscalculations and many small factors that all come together to create a costly and embarrassing mishap for the country. They're mainly found under the hood and wouldn't be apparent to your average onlooker. But then we have the Hoche, where the failings in her construction are pretty much obvious at first sight. She started out her life already at a disadvantage, having been ordered by the French in 1880, but not coming into service until a full 11 years later in 1891. The French shipyard which built her took so long to complete the project that by the time she was finished, the world had already moved on from ironclads like her, and as such, she was already basically obsolete upon launch. It doesn't take a warship historian to point out exactly what was wrong with the Hoche. She was top-heavy as all get out due to a very large superstructure and her low freeboard. In fact, her superstructure was so enormous, even for the time, that it earned her the nickname of the Grand Hotel. And this decision was made due to the fact that the French desperately wanted their warships to appear foreboding and menacing, hulking above the horizon in an aesthetic known as the fierce face. Her masts were positively massive, and her guns were mounted on almost every available surface. But this, however, led to some seriously unstable ships, which had difficulty at times keeping afloat under their own weight. The freeboard, on the other hand, was so low that the ship would struggle in anything but a flat calm, and couldn't sail far from the coast without danger of being swamped. Now, this was all compounded by the fact that she was overweight on completion, which meant that the Hoche was entirely too unstable to be considered seaworthy by most accounts. And on top of the superstructure being altogether too tall, it was also fitted with numerous unnecessary windows, which were considered weak points in the armour scheme of the ship. Even further, the decision to extend the superstructure above the turrets was also controversial, because damage to this part of the superstructure could also damage or then block the gun turrets, thereby reducing firepower. The ship was towering and awkward, and not at all suitable for anything much further out from the coast, let alone an all-out sea battle. All this being said, the French were not ignorant to the issues presented by the Hoche, and she saw many refits over the course of her career to correct these issues. In 1895, 6 of her guns were removed to help lighten up some of the heft that she was carrying, and then later, a more extensive refit lasting from 1899 to 1902 saw that the engines and boilers were replaced, the single large stack was brought down to 2 smaller ones, and then 2 of her torpedo tubes were removed. But perhaps most importantly, a large portion of the overwhelmingly tall superstructure was cut away to lower her centre of mass. Her intended waterline was restored so that her side armour was now able to effectively keep above the water. And after all was said and done, this behemoth was whittled down by about 250 tons. And after this refit, she proved to be much more stable. It appears that the French had learnt their lesson, though the Hoche would still go on to be remembered as one of the worst warships ever to be put to sea. A lot of design failures we cover on this channel come from the late 1800s, and for good reason. This was an awkward time in warship design when sail had just finally given way to steam, and new technology was appearing untested all the time. And one German class of gunboat was absolutely hated by its crews, and the issues were typified by the class leader. The SMS Vesper was the result of some tactical thinking that dated way back to the age of sail, where bombarding enemy forces on shore or at sea was a challenge thanks to the limited range of guns. So the idea was to fit a powerful, long-range gun on as small a platform as possible so that the boat could retreat to shallow waterways where it would be out of the range and impossible to be chased by larger, more powerful enemy ships. In the 1870s, Germany had to defend itself from amphibious invasion. The coastal defense gunboat was just what it needed. But aside from being born of maybe outdated tactical thinking, the Vesper was also conceived under some other unusual circumstances. For example, the naval chief of staff at the time was a former cavalry general, and the Admiralty Design Office had total inexperience in designing such a ship, and the German steel industry was incapable of producing the steel plating, which had to be eventually imported from Britain for the first 4 vessels. Vesper, to be fair, differed from other gunboats from the time. Usually the guns were fixed in place and could rotate only by turning the whole ship. But Vesper improved on this because she was expected to engage the enemy in shallow water, maybe even with her bottom resting on the sea floor. So the gun would need to be trained and rotated on its own. 10 of the Vesper-Class were built, the first German warships to be built without sails, but it was about here that all the positive innovation ended. The boats were wide, slow, and extremely sluggish. They were hard to maneuver and turn. Despite their width, they had a tendency to heel in the water. This wasn't a huge problem though, because they weren't expected to stay out in the open ocean, but it still resulted in drawing ire from their crews for their poor seaworthiness. They were heavy too. The ship's bows were reinforced with thick plated armour to protect the forward end from where it would be pointed at the enemy. They were also extremely cramped. The ships were meant to be as small a target as practically possible, and the engineers achieved this goal, but at the expense of the crew. It also meant they had very limited range, because the boats just weren't big enough to fit a big coal bunker. The crews turned nasty. They called the boats mud bugs and tidal slippers. Some creative insults there. Just how effective these strange little ships were is characterized by the bizarre service history of Vesper herself. She was only commissioned a few times sporadically between 1876 and 1885. But in the end, technology overtook Vesper and her sisters when the first fast torpedo boat was introduced, consigning the German coastal gunboats to the history books. Vesper was sold and became a lighter in 1910. She was finally broken up. In the interwar period following 1918, the world's navies agreed to limit the size and capacity of their ships. This resulted in some pretty unusual designs, and for one nation's navy in particular, some poor design choices that would lead to a scandal. During the course of World War I, the Allies, comprising the UK, the US, France, Italy and Japan, had all built up impressive naval fleets. But immediately after the war, there was concern amongst the Allied powers of the potential for a naval arms race as this momentum continued. And that would prove costly for countries already reeling from the expenses of war, and unpopular with the public who were clamouring for peacetime. In an attempt to appease the public and slow further progression towards this arms race, the Washington Naval Treaty was signed in 1922 among the major Allied powers. Now, as part of this treaty, limits were placed on the size and weight of future warship construction in an attempt to keep any one navy from outclassing the others. But where the other signatories saw an agreement to equalise their navies, Japan instead saw loopholes. In an attempt to circumvent the limitations imposed by the treaty, the Imperial Japanese Navy, or the IJN, came up with the idea to build vessels that were too lightweight to be considered legitimate members of that category as per the treaty, but then outfit them as heavily as vessels twice their size. And by doing so, they were still bulking up their naval power, using smaller scale versions of the vessels that they had been producing for the war, without sacrificing on the firepower, and therefore without technically violating any terms of the treaty. Enter the now infamous and illegal torpedo boat, the Tomozuru. Tomozuru weighed in at only about 600 tons, but was positively overloaded with complex and heavy gun systems. Her high centre of gravity also led to serious stability issues in rough seas. Now, it's rather easy to imagine how such a design may cause structural problems, and we now know these issues would sadly prove fatal. In what would become known as the Tomozuru incident in March of 1934, during a routine nighttime torpedo exercise in rough weather, radio contact with the Tomozuru was suddenly lost. Initially, it was assumed to be the result of power loss or radio failure, but 15 minutes later, however, Tomozuru's lights were completely dark. A search and rescue mission would find the Tomozuru capsized, floating completely upside down, some 10 hours later. The ship was ultimately towed to shore, while 16 men somehow managed to survive. 100 sailors, including the captain, sadly perished in the disaster. The Tomozuru incident was ultimately attributed to the myriad design flaws present on the ship. The structure was horrifically top-heavy, fitted with far too many heavy guns and munitions for the ship's comparatively small size. Munitions were also fully loaded at the time of her capsizing, which had not been the case during her sea trials, and this also contributed to an even greater instability than originally feared. And with all of these factors taken together, combined with the unfavourable weather conditions, the Tomozuru had been completely unable to keep herself upright. As a result of the incident, a committee was established by the IJN to identify weaknesses across their entire fleet. Many vessels like Tomozuru had been designed with the exploit of a loophole in mind, and they were summarily declared to be unseaworthy. A total of 14 vessels were found to have potentially catastrophic stability issues, and these issues were summarily addressed and corrected. However, this incident would ultimately prove to be a scandal for the Japanese Navy, delaying the construction of new vessels for several crucial years while they sought to correct the errors in their present-day fleet. Guns were downsized and reduced in number, deck heights were lowered, and excess equipment was removed, whilst bulges and ballasts were added to the hulls of the ships for stability. Now, whilst the Japanese undoubtedly believed their design concept was clever and that it would allow the freedom to build up their naval force while also circumventing the limitations created by the Washington Naval Treaty, in reality, these concepts would have fatal consequences that sent shockwaves throughout the nation. Inevitably, they learnt from their mistakes, and the loopholes in the treaty were later closed as a result, but it was too little too late for the 100 men lost in the Tomozuru incident. All too often, lessons in design and ship construction are paid for in human lives, and that is what makes Tomozuru one of the worst warships ever built. Now, we all know the traditional recipe for a First and Second World War era submarine was for a relatively small maneuverable vessel with a light deck gun. Of course, the defining feature of a submarine is its ability to submerge, often for long periods of time, hours on end, but war always opens the door for experimentation, and the British were just as keen as their enemies to explore some unusual avenues to gain the upper hand. Introducing the British M-Class submarine, a glass cannon that packed a massive punch. The M-Class submarines were in many ways similar to other British subs around the time of the First World War. They were longer than Germany's U-boats, with the first of the class, HMS M1, coming in at an impressive 295 feet or 90 meters, with a slightly greater displacement than that of the German equivalent, like the U-151. Look, it's not the dimensions of the M-Class submarine that makes them unhinged. Like many of the ships in this series, it was their choice of weaponry. Remember, submarines at the time usually featured small, relatively light deck gun calibers, similar to light cruisers or the secondaries you might find on battleships. Originally, submarines had adhered to cruiser rules. They surfaced, ordered their prey to stop, and then be abandoned, and then sank them with their deck guns. But as the war went on, and the so-called prey began to fight back, the torpedo became the main weapon of the submarine. Now, the M-class subs did carry torpedoes, but they also carried an absolutely enormous 12-inch 40 caliber cannon. Now, for those of you who aren't big gun aficionados, this 12-inch gun had a bore length of a whopping 480 inches over 12 meters, about the length of a bus. It weighed over 50 tons, a monstrous thing installed by the mad lads at Armstrong Whitworth. But the truth is, the guns were made for a very different original purpose. They had equipped the formidable class Pre-Dreadnought battleships, which were being removed from service by the end of the war because they were tragically outdated. But their guns still worked just fine, so onto the M-class submarines they went. So why did the British Admiralty decide that the M-class submarine would be best served by a simply massive 50-ton gun? Well, believe it or not, it may not have been as crazy a concept as it sounds. The Royal Navy had hoped to operate 4 M-class subs in place of the final 4 K-class submarines that had been planned. The K-class had been canned, for very good reasons that we've covered before. The M-class was supposed to be a submersible monitor that could easily surface, fire at a target either at sea or on land, and then quickly disappear below the waves again. It was thought that the gun would be more effective against moving ships at close ranges than torpedoes. A hit at close range from this gargantuan gun would have been devastating, especially on unarmoured merchant ships or lightly armoured destroyers or cruisers. Firing from periscope depth at close range, the gun was easy to aim using a simple bead sight aligned with the periscope, effectively giving the submarine's commander a 31 centimetre, 12-inch diameter sniper rifle. And honestly, as a guy who enjoys firing historic firearms, I'm a little jealous. In theory, it was a good idea. A hit from a 12-inch gun would obliterate most targets submarines encountered while they were on patrol. But, of course, the gun did have some drawbacks, despite its awesome firepower. Actually, there were quite a few drawbacks. The gun was difficult to operate because it had to be squeezed into a housing forward of the conning tower in a space so tight that men could barely stand up inside without banging their heads. The fairing did give some small amount of traverse to the gun, 15 degrees port or starboard and 20 degrees up, but it effectively turned the submarine into something more akin to an ocean-going turretless tank destroyer. Coupled with the fact the submarine, being fairly small, would be tossed around by the waves, and there was no stabilization provided, it surely would have made actually aiming and firing the gun beyond anything but close range a very interesting proposal indeed. But if actually using the gun proved tricky, then taking care of it was a whole other thing entirely. If the correct procedure wasn't followed exactly to prepare it for firing, or if water managed to enter the barrel while the sub was submerged, it could be easily damaged. On no fewer than 2 occasions, HMS M1 lost half her barrel length of the 12-inch gun because water had managed to get into it before firing. The gun was usually fired from periscope depth, but it was relatively slow to reload because the submarine had to surface, and it took crews over 3 minutes to load a new round, leaving their submarine vulnerable to attack. And the M-class, with its fragile pressure hull and protruding large conning tower, was never meant to engage in a gun duel. The concept would only work if the M-class could fire one shot, knock out their target in one fell swoop, and escape. Because the gun was so heavy, it also affected the vessel's handling. When she was submerged, the M-class subs were actually very well behaved, but when they surfaced, they were really top-heavy, which is a characteristic common among many of the unhinged warships we've looked at. If you're starting to see a couple of flaws in the plan and you think maybe the theory behind it might be a little bit wonky, then congratulations, because you seem to have more foresight than the British Admiralty did, because they decided to go ahead with a few M-class submarines to see what they could do, and the results weren't great. The British Navy had hoped to put 4 M-classes into service, but only 3 were ever commissioned. Of those planned, only HMS M1, completed in 1917, was operating before the conclusion of the war, and once peace had returned to Europe, there was little need for these submarine monitors, and their effectiveness couldn't really be tested properly in action. The M-class subs were dealt another blow in 1922, with the Washington Naval Convention restricting submarine armament, effectively putting the idea of the submarine monitor to bed for good. After the Washington Naval Convention, only the M1 retained her 12-inch gun, and her career was largely uneventful. She was mostly used to carry out training exercises. But unfortunately, the M1 didn't enjoy a benign end in a scrapyard after years of uneventful service. On the 19th of November, 1925, the Swedish collier Vidar reported a collision with an unknown object, which had happened a few days earlier on the morning of the 12th November off the coast of Devon. Now, HMS M1 had been missing since the morning of the 12th, where she'd been conducting exercises with two of her sister subs. When Vidar's damaged hull was examined, it was found that she had paint matching the missing submarines. The timing of the collision and the paint on Vidar's hull all but confirmed the fate of HMS M1. Vidar had actually ripped M1's massive gun clean off, and the resulting hole allowed the vessel to rapidly flood and sink like a stone. Her crew had made a rush to escape, but it all happened so quickly, and her entire crew of 70 lost their lives. After the loss of M1 in 1925, M2 and M3 were reassigned for experimental use. By this time, it seems the Navy had a bit of an inkling that the submarine monitor was a bit of a white elephant. Both vessels lost their famous 12-inch guns, with M2 getting a new but exciting task. Forward of her conning tower, where the monstrous gun had once been, a hangar was installed. HMS M2 had become one of the first aircraft carrying submarines. She carried a specially designed seaplane, the Parnell Peto, and that small biplane was designed to Admiralty specifications. It also posed significant challenges for designers because the hangar it would have been stored in was extremely small. So the solution was to, of course, make the wings foldable, allowing the plane to be stored more easily. Initially, the plane was to be lowered into the water by an overhead crane, and it would take off from the water. But in 1928, a hydraulic system was installed, allowing the plane to take off straight from M2's deck. It was hoped that the M2 would prove the concept of the aircraft carrying submarine, and she was used for years for naval exercises, but her career too would be cut short like that of her sister. On January 26, 1932, M2 left her base off the Isle of Portland in the English Channel, heading to conduct exercises off the Dorset coast. Now, this kind of work was routine for M2 and her crew, and there was no reason to think that anything unusual would happen. At 10:11 a.m, she radioed her submarine depot ship, the Titania, that she planned to dive around 20 minutes later, but she was never heard from again, and all 60 of her men lost their lives. Unlike M1, M2's wreck was located just over a week after her sinking. In fact, there were even plans, and then attempts to raise the wreckage, one almost successful, but in the end the plans were abandoned, and HMS M2 still lies in the English Channel. When the wreck was discovered, it was found that her hangar door was still open, clearly an indicator of a huge failure either in procedure or technology. Either her crew had failed to shut the door properly, if at all, or that the hangar door itself had failed outright, an improper seal causing flooding perhaps, or even that the hydroplanes, which were supposed to help keep the submarine on the surface early into the airplane launching procedure in a pinch, had failed. The M2 would have dropped like a stone with the hangar door still wide open. Chillingly, a distress message was found the next month scratched onto a chunk of wood paneling, simply saying, "Help, M2 gone down, number 2 hatch open." Interestingly, after the loss of M2, the Royal Navy totally abandoned the idea of aircraft carrying submarines, although Japan in particular carried on with the concept and eventually perfected it. In the end, the final remaining M-class sub, the M3, had been converted to become an experimental mine layer in 1928, and the days of the British submarine monitor were over for good. Fortunately, this role was marred only by mediocrity instead of tragedy, when it was found that her refit badly affected her handling and diving. In rough weather, the M3 was a sitting duck, taking up to 13 minutes to dive compared to the 60 to 80 seconds of her contemporaries. So shortly after M2's demise, the British Admiralty decided to strike the M3 from their register and sell her for scrap. The M-class subs never got to realise their potential in battle, and maybe, just maybe, that enormous 12-inch sniper rifle could have done some damage in exactly the right set of circumstances. But it seems fairly unlikely, and today they exist only as a distant memory of a time when a massive gun on a fairly small submarine seemed to make a good deal of sense. There must have been something in the water at the British Admiralty during the First World War, because they were obsessed with going overboard on big guns. It resulted in a series of weird and wonderful ships. The Lord Clive monitors were among the best of them. Launched in 1915, HMS General Wolfe wasn't an overly unique or special ship in her early days. The final of 8 Lord Clive-Class monitors, she was typical of a monitor for the time. Fairly slow, a lumbering vessel that was designed to hug the shore and rain down fury on the coastline with her enormous gun. So there was nothing overly unique about the General Wolf's initial configuration, because monitors were a very well-established class by that point, and navies across the globe were investing in them. She wouldn't get a moment in the sun until the end of the war, after a dramatic refit gave her one of the biggest guns to ever go to sea. Displacing just under 6,000 tons, a little over 330 feet or 100 metres long, the Lord Clive-Class were built to supplement Britain's Abercrombie-class monitors. Now, generally speaking, monitors of the time were a fairly quick and easy way of getting big battleship-caliber guns to sea if the opportunity arose. The Abercrombie-class were armed when the Bethlehem Steel Company of the US sold the 14-inch guns which had been intended for installation aboard a cancelled German-made Greek battleship, so it was truly an international affair. To bolster the effort, it was decided that the old Majestic-class battleships should be retired from service, meaning that the Admiralty suddenly had a nice surplus of 12-inch guns. To get them out to sea, the Lord Clive-Class was designed and built to field the guns. Although their range was officially limited to around 13,700 yards, it's about 12.5 kilometres, with little creative positioning of the guns, the elevation could be increased to strike targets out to 21,000 yards or 19 kilometres. Now keep that in mind, because soon the last of the class, the General Wolfe, was going to be given an impressive upgrade. As the 8 ships entered service, they were sent throughout the Mediterranean, the English Channel and the North Sea, with General Wolfe being used along the Belgian coast to cause as much disruption to the occupying German forces as possible. When they entered service, the Lord Clive-Class's 12-inch guns were more than sufficient for the task, with General Wolfe seeing intense action through 1916 and 1917. She was extremely useful as a coastal bombardment ship because the situation suited her design so well. There, just ashore, lay all the German defensive works and the artillery batteries that General Wolfe and her kind could hit with relative ease thanks to spotting from aeroplanes. But despite her success as a monitor in 1916 and 1917, as is the case in wartime, there's always a bigger gun. And in this case, the guns were coming from Germany, with 17-inch coastal guns being installed at the Deutschland battery at Breden in Belgium in 1917. The British needed to respond, and respond they did. Around the same time as the Deutschland battery was proving a nuisance for the Royal Navy, Admiral Reginald Bacon of the Dover Patrol had convinced the Admiralty of the need for larger guns for some of his monitors working off the Belgian coast. Now this is where the General Wolfe, and her sister, the Lord Clive for that matter, got very interesting and very unhinged. The General Wolfe, the Lord Clive, and the Prince Eugene were all earmarked to receive a simply astounding 18-inch, 45cm BL Mark I naval gun in 1918. This was the largest gun ever fitted to a Royal Naval vessel. In fact, it's second only to the guns of the mighty Japanese battleship Yamato. These monsters could fire a 3,320 pound, that's a 1,500 kilogram shell, at 2,420 feet, or 740 meters per second. Now that's a projectile as heavy as a Range Rover, moving faster than a Concorde jet at full speed. With great power came great sluggishness. The rate of fire was just 1 round for every 3 or 4 minutes. Fitting these huge guns proved tricky, and the Prince Eugene never got hers because the war ended before it could be installed. But General Wolfe and the Lord Clive did see action with their new weapons. Permanently pointing to starboard, the 18-inch gun dominated the vessel's stern and essentially had to be boxed into a mount that weighed, in total, a whopping 384 tons. But General Wolfe and Lord Clive retained their 12-inch guns as well, meaning that these 300-foot, 6,000-ton ships were arguably the most overgunned vessels for their size in the world at the time, capable of throwing a combined weight of 5,020 pounds, nearly 2,300 kilograms of metal with each salvo. The huge 18-inch weapons could lob shells some 40,000 yards, or 36.5 kilometers. But the usefulness of the guns was short-lived despite the considerable effort it took to install them. General Wolfe's gun was installed in July 1918 and trialled in August. She was returned to the Dover Patrol that month, and she saw no action for a while. During this time, thanks to that monumental gun which had significantly altered the shape of her stern, the ship came to be known, affectionately, as the Elephant and Castle, a reference to a well-known Victorian English statue of an elephant with a castle on its back from a pub of the same name. By late September, fighting had ramped up across Western Europe again, and the war was in its final throes with the Entente's 100 Days offensive absolutely devastating German troops. As on the land, the Allies were ramping up their attacks against the Germans from the sea. With the campaign reaching its crescendo, HMS General Wolfe finally had the chance to use her unhinged armament. The morning of the 28th of September, General Wolfe was anchored off the coast of Belgium alongside 3 divisions of monitors, when at around 7:30 am, her massive 18-inch gun came alive, firing 52 shells, a total of 172,640 pounds. That's 78,000 kilograms of metal, some 36,000 yards, or nearly 33 kilometers. Her target was a railway bridge well inland, and she earned herself a few records in the process of trying to knock it out, and the shelling still stands as the longest distance of its kind in Royal Navy history. Despite her service and her impeccable record, the General Wolfe and the other monitors weren't very useful at the end of the war. There was a general feeling that such a terrible conflict would likely never happen again, and if it did, it wouldn't occur for a long time. Now, today we know that this was fairly optimistic. It was unfortunately misplaced optimism, but the Lord Clive-Class had served their purpose as far as the Admiralty was concerned, and General Wolfe was earmarked to be scrapped in 1920. She was sold to Thomas W. Ward, a steel and engineering firm in Sheffield. She was broken up in Hale in 1923. Her massive 18-inch gun was saved though, since it had been taken off in 1920 and used for testing, until it was also scrapped about a decade later, something the British may have come to regret doing just a few years after that. Unlike so many of history's weird and wonderful warships, General Wolfe was actually fairly successful, especially when compared with the M-class subs. While she may have not directly hit the railway bridge in Belgium, she played a vital role in the Dover Patrol for the best part of 3 years, both without and with her giant gun. Usefulness aside, it can't be argued that the small monitor with the big guns trained to the right was a truly unhinged-looking design indeed. They say that a cat can have 9 lives. While the Imperial Japanese Navy's battleship Ise might not have had quite so many, she managed a surprising number of major refits and changes in her nearly 30-year career, so much so that depending on what year each photograph was taken, you might be forgiven for thinking you were looking at a completely different ship. It culminated in her final refit, and her role as a combination battleship aircraft carrier, which gave her truly one of the most unique, unhinged profiles in warship history. For most of her career, the Ise was a pretty standard Japanese dreadnought battleship. A member of the 2 Ise-Class, she was named after an ancient Japanese prefecture, completed in 1917. In her initial configuration, she was a fairly large vessel, displacing just over 30,000 tons in standard trim. She was initially 683 feet or 208 meters long, but despite entering service in the final months of the First World War, she didn't see any action. But despite being left out of the war, she did see service through a number of very interesting scenarios. Everything from the Russian Civil War through to assisting in earthquake rescue and recovery, the Ise proved to be a valuable member of the Imperial Navy. Technology moved really quickly in the naval world, and honestly, ships became much more obsolete there than probably Oceanliners did in the civilian world. Like many late First World War battleships, Ise was able to best this state of flux through a number of refits and reconstructions. Her first refit was carried out in 1927, and then 1928, when modifications were made to her superstructure. And interestingly, given her future, part battleship, part aircraft carrier, her refit in the late 1920s saw Ise gain a flight platform to carry a Mitsubishi 1MF fighter. Soon after, she was fitted with a catapult and a crane to allow her to launch and carry Yokosuka E-1Y floatplanes. And after that, major modernizations were made in the early 1930s when her superstructure was enlarged, and her forward tripod mast was heavily modified, with many levels being added, resembling a pagoda tower. Now, this so-called pagoda mast was a very distinctive feature of Japanese battleships, and it was a fairly dramatic visual alteration. Modifications were made to her armament. She received torpedo bulges as well. She also had yet another aeroplane-related modification with the installation of a crane and catapult in 1933, allowing her to launch and recover more floatplanes. Then she was substantially rebuilt again in August 1935 at the Kure Naval Arsenal, and she didn't return to service until 1937. By 1938 though, Ise was off the southern coast of China when the Second Sino-Japanese War was raging. She remained active in the conflict until early 1941. Now it was apparent that she and her sister were becoming increasingly obsolete. While they were fast and agile at the time of their completion back in 1917, now, 20 years later, the Ise-Class was slow and outgunned, despite all of those modifications. Now, if it weren't for the Battle of Midway in 1942, Ise's end might have come much quicker at the hands of salvage yards striving to keep Japan's hungry war machine sufficiently fed with steel. But then, much larger events intervened. The Battle of Midway was a critical victory for the Allies. It's exactly what they needed at exactly the right time, but Japan's losses were crippling. The Japanese had wanted to remove the United States as a Pacific power, and just 6 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, they were planning an attack on another US military base at Midway Atoll. The assault came on the 3rd of June 1942, but the Americans had broken Japan's codes, and they were anticipating it, with the United States Navy waiting for the Japanese to come. During the battle, 4 of Japan's precious aircraft carriers, thousands of men and hundreds of planes were lost. The Americans weren't unscathed. They lost 1 carrier themselves, and well over 100 men, but their victory made it apparent to the Japanese that America wasn't going away anytime soon. In the aftermath of Midway, the Japanese Navy was in desperate need for more aircraft carriers, which had proved themselves to be the most crucial assets at sea. The decision was made to convert Ise and her sister ship Hyuga to hybrid aircraft carriers to at least somewhat make up for the losses at Midway. Now, it might seem a bit short-sighted to replace full aircraft carriers by just adding small flight decks to obsolete battleships, but the Japanese desperately needed platforms for all their planes, and quickly. Almost as interesting as the Ise and Hyuga's strange new conversion were the planes they were actually intended to carry, some 14 Yokosuka D4Y torpedo bombers and 8 Aichi E-16 float planes for reconnaissance and observation. The Yokosukas were modified to be catapulted off, but they couldn't land on the small flight deck. Unless there was a conventional carrier or a base nearby, the pilots were on a one-way mission. Because Ise had lost 2 of its turrets and their associated guns in the conversion, her main battery was reduced to just 4 14-inch or 356cm guns, which was still an impressive arsenal, and her anti-air defense was heavily bolstered, with dual-purpose 12.7cm guns, dozens of 25mm guns, and a battery of 12.7 anti-aircraft rocket launchers being added. The result was a bizarre-looking ship with a very busy forward end and a flat kind of hunched back behind it. The new hybrid carriers emerged in late 1943, only to be used for training for most of 44. But despite the expense in converting them, they only saw action in the latter part of the war, when in October 1944, Ise, as part of the 4th Carrier Division, was involved in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of the Second World War. Leyte was a last-ditch attempt to thwart the Allied invasion of the Philippines, with almost all remaining Japanese naval vessels playing a part. Under the command of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the 4th Carrier Division was intended to act as a kind of northern decoy to allow the main body of Japanese vessels to amass from the south and the west. Despite Ozawa's intention that the 4th Carrier Division should be easily found and draw the Americans away, the Americans were preoccupied with actually defending their positions from other Japanese attacks, so the 4th Carrier Division was actually the last to be found by the Allies. Then, on the morning of the 25th of October, American forces finally engaged the 4th Division to devastating effect. In fact, Ise and Hyuga weren't even carrying any planes at the time, and they were lucky to survive. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was essentially Ise's final chance at glory, but she was still important to the Japanese war effort. By 1945, the Japanese Navy was devastated, and critical supplies for industry were running low. Operation Kita was devised to return Ise and her sister from their bases in the southwestern Pacific to the homeland, delivering essentials like oil, tin, mercury, and rubber to Kure, where it was badly needed. Early on, Ise was actually damaged by a mine and was hastily repaired, but amazingly, the convoy of Operation Kita was actually able to avoid attack or pursuit by more than 20 British and American submarines who'd spotted them along the way. Arriving safely in Kure on the 20th of February, Ise was placed finally in reserve. She was painted a light green in an attempt to camouflage her, but it was a vain effort. On the 19th of March 1945, American aircraft raided Kure Harbour, and there, docked with no fuel and no aircraft, was Ise, and she was a sitting duck. She was hit by 2 bombs and badly damaged, but amazingly, she didn't sink, so she was towed to the nearby island of Ondo Seto, where she was used as a floating anti-aircraft battery to defend against incoming aircraft. Between the 24th of July and the 28th, she was subject to American attacks, and then slowly settled in the shallow waters where she'd been moored. She was finally struck from the Japanese Naval Registry after the war in November 1945 and was scrapped in situ in 1947, bringing to an end the life of one of Japan's most Swiss Army knife-like warships and one of history's great unhinged warship designs. Our final weird and wonderful warship comes from France, and let's just say it looks something more out of Howl's Moving Castle than the Victorian era. With her exaggerated tumble-home hull and 274mm gun turrets perched on each side, the Carnot is today classified as a pre-Dreadnought battleship, and these were the dominant style of battleship in many of Europe's navies between 1880 and 1900, replacing the earlier Ironclads of the 1860s and 70s. The pre-Dreadnoughts were, as their name suggests, built before the dominating HMS Dreadnought, whose design came to define battleships of the 20th century. But before then, battleships were decidedly more awkward in appearance and layout, with a dazzling mix of gun calibers and weirdly shaped hulls and structures. Carnot is probably one of the strangest. She was the second of 5 broadly similar French battleships, alongside her semi-sister ships, the Charles Martel, the Jaurès-Guibéry, the Masséna, and Bouvet, all named for famous French commanders and statesmen. These 5 ships were in turn an evolution of France's first pre-Dreadnought, the notoriously unstable Brennus. While the ships were similar, there were enough differences between them that they couldn't be considered really a single class. It's true that Carnot and her half-sisters were far from identical, but they did, however, share a fantastic, almost steampunk profile and a reputation for instability when out at sea. For the latter part of the 19th century, France had been the world's second strongest naval power, so Britain's Naval Defence Act of 1889, which sought to dramatically increase the strength of the already dominating Royal Navy, spurred the French Admiralty into action. The French hastily introduced legislation to grow and modernise their own navy substantially, in an attempt to maintain their position as the world's number 2 on the high seas. Now, the French had built some fine warships, particularly their Ironclads, in the second half of the 1800s, which makes the curious design of their new naval ships and their shortcomings even more fascinating. Built at Toulon, Carnot was laid down in 1891, measuring 114 metres or 374 feet long. She had a beam of about 21 metres or 70 feet and displaced a whopping 11,954 tonnes. So she was in many ways an evolution of Charles Martel. Like Brennus, whose design was adapted for Carnot and her 4 running mates, it was found that Charles Martel was also top-heavy and unstable. Now, this top-heaviness was mostly due to her gargantuan superstructure. Despite her tendency to pitch and roll in heavy weather, Charles Martel had a high freeboard, that is the height between the waterline and the top of the hull, or basically how much ship there is actually above the waterline. So she did handle rough weather conditions pretty well. Considering her inherent top-heavy nature, modifications were made to Carnot's design to address the instability seen in Charles Martel, and they were largely made to Carnot's superstructure in an attempt to lower her centre of gravity. While all of the Carnot's half-sisters were unconventional, Carnot herself was the ship that probably broke the mold the most. Take her funnels, for example. Most ships have funnels that are arranged in sets of nearly identical dimensions, but not the Carnot. Her forward funnel was actually larger than that of her after one, and noticeably so. Now obviously, like all battleships, Carnot's guns were her most important feature. In fact, it was those enormous guns that really helped to make her look so strange. In particular were those 274mm gun turrets, which sat either side of her hull. To that end, Carnot's hull was built with an extremely exaggerated tumble home, that is, the narrowing of the hull above the waterline and flaring out towards it, a common feature on battleships in the early days. But Carnot's tumble home was something else, presumably intended to give the ship ample stability while reducing the weight higher up. Built into her hull were a vast number of portholes and windows. It's almost as though she was designed to look like a battleship of the late 17th century with gun ports dotted along her sides. Of course, drilling holes in a battleship isn't probably the smartest move, and the portholes weren't to Carnot's advantage, dramatically reducing the effectiveness of her watertight compartments and her armoured protection. Her foremast, perched atop her turret-like bridge, gives the impression of a turret on a castle. The whole effect is a ship that seriously looks like a floating fortress, and when underway, with her funnels absolutely belching smoke, she could even be thought to resemble a factory. But despite her spectacular appearance, the Carnot had a relatively uneventful career. By the time she was completed in 1897, she was already obsolete, especially in comparison to the vessels being used by the British. Her first role after being commissioned into the French fleet was to steam with 2 of her half-sisters, Charles Martel and Jaurès-Guibéry, to join with the great European navies in the International Squadron. A major conflict was brewing on Crete, with uprisings against the island's Ottoman rule escalating. The role of Carnot off Crete was minor. She spent the rest of her career alternating between the French Navy's northern and Mediterranean squadrons. By the end of the 1900s, Carnot was becoming even more out of date, especially once Britain's incredible HMS Dreadnought redefined battleship design totally, as well as construction. But it wasn't just Dreadnought that placed Carnot at risk of scrapping. France had begun introducing the much more modern Danton-class battleships in 1911. In fact, the rate of design improvement was such that by January 1913, Carnot was nothing more than a spare, and she would have looked like a relic from a bygone era. She wasn't called upon for service in World War I, but surprisingly, she saw out the war laid up with Charles Martel instead of being scrapped. She was officially struck from the French Navy's register in 1922 and sold for scrap, little more than a museum piece at a time when battleships had been refined into superb masters of the ocean. Now look, it's probably easy to imagine France's enormous floating castle, with the guns just strapped onto her side, as maybe a failure. She was hardly used as a battleship, notoriously unstable, and sat through the largest conflict the world had seen idly. But the reality was that Carnot and her half-siblings were built as a scramble to modernise an ailing fleet, as naval developments forged on with an unrelenting disregard for those who couldn't keep up. Carnot and her half-siblings weren't hugely successful in service, but thankfully they kind of didn't need to be. The 1890s and the early 1900s were fairly peaceful in comparison to what would come in the 1910s, with Carnot and her companions tiding the French Navy over until more modern warships could be built. But fortunately, their existence provides us today with some truly dramatic photos from a time when floating factories and castles ruled the waves. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.